So Saul, is there anything that when you say that none of the other organizations are moving forward um, in regards to the UNDRIP, there's a lot of people that really don't understand what UNDRIP is about. And I know I spoke to a constitutional lawyer last week, and he was saying that UNDRIP is basically got good intentions, and that it really has no strength or carries any law. Yeah.
Okay. See, every government that recognizes UNDRIP has to give it legal effect under their government jurisdictional laws. So what Canada's doing is trying to get that UNDRIP piece of legislation through the House to give legal effect to that UNDRIP declaration so that they can implement and enforce it across government, not just by one department or one agency, but it would impact on the whole government and parliament. Now, we say we're sovereign. We have governments, we have rights, and we have status. Well, I just described to you how we have to implement it ourselves under our laws of jurisdiction. Now, UNDRIP provides recognition for everything that we talk about. It provides recognition to the sovereignty of our nations, recognizes the national powers of our governments, national powers of treaty making, recognizes the treaties we've made as international treaties, not domestic treaties. Now, just for the people listening, our treaties are identified as international treaties, but they have to be given legal effect by both parties to the treaty to maintain the international status of the treaty. But nobody's given them legal effect under their government jurisdictional law. We haven't, and the Crown government hasn't either. But the modern day treaties that they made, like the James Bay Cree Naskapi Agreement, the Nisga'a Agreement, the Inuit ones, and so on, the Yukon ones, they're called modern day treaties. Why? Because only one government's given them legal effect. That's the federal government and provincial government or territorial government. No Indian governments have given legal effect to those treaties. That's the fundamental difference between the treaties we have and the treaties that they have, called the modern day treaties. So when you look at UNDRIP, see, do you know anything about the Organization of American States Declaration? Nobody knows anything about that. Yet it's similar to UNDRIP, eh? Except it does more to recognize the treaties than UNDRIP does. Now, UNDRIP recognizes your citizenship status, controlled and under your jurisdiction and your government, and it recognizes all our rights that we talk about in terms of inherent rights and treaty rights. It recognizes our inherent title to lands and resources. So when you look at the lands and resources reserved by treaty making, the national powers of treaty making, and people don't go there either. It's just reserved lands by band that they deal with. 640 acres per family of 5 for an agricultural reserve for farmland. When it goes on to say, due respect having had the lands presently cultivated, occupied and improved prior to treaty. Those lands remain our lands. Those were lands that were improved by Métis, are the Métis lands. The settlers that were here, because they occupied land and improved them for agricultural purposes, they got awarded those lands as their lands when treaties were made. Now, if they can do that for the non-Indian, they can damn well do it for us. But in addition to that, then, and it goes on to say, and other reserves. But we never talk about those other reserves. What are they? They're fishing stations, timber bursts. For what? For socioeconomic benefit, for habitats, for animals and birds, for shelter, for us to harvest timber, for building homes, gathering our medicines, gathering our berries and so on. Then there's the haylands again, in addition to the 640 acres. But along with that is the traditional land and resource territories that are reserved by treaty making. And those are shared territories of our people, whether they're Indian, Métis, or non-status Indians, still have those rights and that status. When we look at that whole process, you see, we don't go there in terms of how we reserved lands by treaty making. And so far, they've spent 1.6 billion on implementing treaty land entitlement for reserves by ban. And we got all this other land that we should be going after. Wayway in Manitoba just got last year 250 million for loss of use of their traditional land and resource territory in Treaty 2. And then the Six Nations, prior to making a treaty, they lost their traditional lands and territory. They just got a settlement of 288 million, plus 18,000 acres. And in Manitoba, the Dakota band got 50 million. They don't have a treaty, but that was for the loss of their use of their traditional lands and resource territory. So the people that you represent, you see, whether they're Indian, non-status, Métis, their members, their families occupied land and improved the land somewhere in the country here. And those are supposed to remain their lands, in addition to what's recognized by the treaty making that we've done.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions. This one comes from Melvina, and she's asking, in terms of the registry for the Métis people, should the government of Canada take this role on in the same way it keeps up band lists?
Yes, they should do the same thing for Métis as they do for Inuit and Indians. That's the federal government's constitutional, legal, jurisdictional responsibility. But you see, the Métis aren't pushing it to get it done and organized properly. Now, to do that, a Métis has to have a registration of their membership. And in some cases, they're determining membership by the status of lands that they occupy. That's not the issue. The issue is how you inherited your status as Métis or Indian. And that comes from the female side of the family, not from having a land base or a territory. And that's critical too, but to get registered as a member with citizenship and status, the feds have to have a registration accounting the number of Indians, Métis, and Inuit that they have to provide services for. And they have legal political obligations for everyone. Like I said, under the Constitution now, Section 35, 2, there's no such thing as a non-status Indian. Indians are recognized as have constitutional recognition as Indians, period. Like the treaties do. Now, one of the courts also decided here on Ochapo's court case a few months ago, the treaties recognize treaty band status of bands. That's over and above the Indian Act recognition of a band. And I've said that for many years. But now there's a federal court case saying that. Now the Métis just won a court case in Manitoba that struck down the policies of the federal government, where they had a policy where there was ever any illegal activity impacting on our lands that we lost. They were immune from that. Well, as a result of the Métis court case, the judge ruled that there's no immunity for Canada, the Crown, respecting any lands that are lost illegally. Because we had a group of federal officials that organized to steal lands, of Indian lands. And I investigated that and rebuilt that activity from 1893 to 1926. Major fraud. So they're losing left and right, but we got to get our homework done.
Are collective rights different from individual rights? And
Yes,
how are the Métis Nation or Métis people of Alberta have their rights?
they have the same. The Métis people of Alberta have inherent rights that are collective rights, and our people will say our collective rights reinforces the individual rights. See, the non-Indian human rights, they just recognize individual rights. They don't recognize collective rights because they say it takes away from the recognition of individual rights. No way. That reinforces your rights. And how does it do that? Well, collectively, we have responsibility collectively for all those inherent rights and duties and responsibilities associated with all those rights. And that's whether you're Indian or Métis. So the Métis have all those benefits that flow from inherent rights, but they don't go there. Like when Harry took that court case in Manitoba to court, I told him, don't leave out your inherent rights and your status and benefits under inherent rights. But they didn't include it. So they got basically an empty court case decision on that issue of their inherent rights and their status. But it doesn't mean they don't have them. They have it. But it's a matter of how you move ahead to enforce it. So yeah, the Métis have full benefits of all the inherent rights that they've inherited from their Indian side of the family.
Right. So Saul, I think I'm aware of what is going on in Alberta and so I'm kind of getting what her second question is they have Métis locals trying to make negotiations on behalf of the community, and they're one without any information going to the locals. So that is where her concern is coming from.
Okay, now go back to what I talked about in terms of your inherent sovereignty and your collective powers of governing. The Métis people in each of those communities have what you call national powers of self-determination. That includes them determining how you govern your affairs internally, externally, and internationally under your government jurisdiction law. So those associations that they're forming, again, those are just local corporate entities under provincial corporate law. You need to move ahead with your political organizations and governing structures of the Métis communities, individually and collectively. That's what has to be done. I started one in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and one of the national leaders of the Métis Nation went the following week to tell them you can't do that. It's against the law. when we went to Yorkton, the Friendship Center was packed with young people, middle-aged people, and elders. They were just happy to learn what they had in terms of their rights and their powers of governing. So they were all set to move ahead with setting up their Métis government, and they got stopped by their own people, own leaders. But they'll do it. It'll get done.
Yeah. So one of the other questions is, does being involved in an armed resistance, say 1885, have any effect on Indigenous rights?
No. Under the treaties, again, if you go to the treaties, we're exempt from participating in Crown's wars and military activity. Now you see, back that time, Indians were basically, along with Métis, very powerful. See, after that 1812, that war with the U.S. anyway, between England and the U.S.
Oh, yes. Yep.
See, the English took off. It was the Indians that won that war.
Yeah.
And sent the Americans scrambling home. So I thought when a nation wins a war, everything is owned by them. But England claimed what the Indians won for them. But then Pontiac went ahead to start taking down those forts, and destroying them, because he saw them exercising their powers and authority under that process. So when they saw that happening, they immediately went back to England, and that's how they had come up with the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in order to prevent and take advantage of what they thought they gained, but that's what they did. So yeah, the Métis right now, and that's what I've been saying to the Métis and the Inuit and the Indians. It's time for you to organize your political organizational governing structures right in your communities. That's where the power is. That's where the inherent rights and powers are for governing. It's with the people, the families, not with leadership, like the non-Indian system has. So when you set up a corporate entity, you lose all that authority.
We have a question from Chris, and he asks, are there any positive changes you see coming?
Major ones. If we get to understand the thing that I'm talking about and promoting, that'll affect major changes. But you see, keep in mind now, what we're talking about, what I'm presenting. When you look at the MPs, members, the cabinet ministers in Ottawa, you're lucky if 1/3 of them understand what I'm talking about. The deputies and ADMs, even worse. So we have to educate them, and that takes time. So keep in mind that political change, like 1 year in your lifetime, it's like 100 years of political change. That's how long political change takes. So don't get impatient. I started when I was 15 in First Nations politics. I'm now 79. I've spent over 62 years in Indian politics. And because I'm not elected, some of my own people try to stop me from what I'm doing. I said, I earned what I'm doing. If you spent as much time as I have doing what I'm doing and achieved what I've done in my leadership, you wouldn't be insulting me by saying I have to be elected to represent our people. So I go ahead and represent our people anyway, without being elected, because I've earned it. After 62 bloody years in the business, I think I've earned it.
Yeah.
And the other half of my family on my mom's side are Métis. So I work with both sides, both Métis and Indians.
So Saul, do you think, and I've always been of the firm belief that the government has always been very fearful of all the Indigenous groups joining together.
And, yes.
Yeah. And I've always said that is their biggest fear. And they put a lot of propaganda out there so that we end up fighting amongst each other.
Well, they also designed policies and laws to divide us into bands and communities, making it illegal for even up to 1950 under the Indian Act. It was illegal for us to assemble.
Oh my gosh!
Like in 1950, they could walk in on you right now and on me, and we could be arrested.
Yeah.
For what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Politically, 1956 is like yesterday in terms of political development.
Isn't that a horrible thought?
But you can imagine what our people have gone through, eh?
Right.
Yeah.
When I was speaking with this constitutional lawyer, I had asked him about if a group of people were to take the federal government to court in regards to the colonization acts and legislation, and saying that they were imposed on us as a group of people, and because the government keeps saying we're nation to nation. So if we're nation to nation, in what you said earlier about if we're truly two nations negotiating a treaty, then we would have to agree upon, both groups would have to agree upon. And so I asked this constitutional lawyer what the chances would be with a case like that. And he said he doesn't know that he would find a judge that would be willing to say that. So you're
Well,
right. It's
there's
going
what,
to take education.
yeah, but you see, we can do that through our own justice system. We get our own court set up.
Right.
We can take them to court through our own justice system. But just recently in Ontario, Don Worm, one of the Indian lawyers from here, was linked up with lawyers over there on that last court case they won on
Mm-hmm.
annuities under the Robinson Treaty. And they took time to educate her in her court. And they brought elders in as witnesses to help educate her. And
Oh,
she started to acknowledge and recognize our inherent legal system. That's how she arrived at that decision that she did in favor of Indians getting their increases annually and retroactively for their treaty payments. So it's happening.
Is that's coming out of, I believe it's Serpent River Reserve out of Ontario?
Somewhere in the area, but it was a collective one by many of the bands from that treaty area.
Right. Wouldn't
Yes.
that be interesting if they got if the annuity payments were actually increased based on inflation?
Yeah, indexing, yeah.
Yeah.
And you see the Maori in New Zealand.
Right.
You heard our people talk about Rupert's Land here.
Right.
Well, the Crown set up similar type entities in New Zealand, Australia, and India for taking control of lands and resources. So the one they set up in New Zealand, the Maoris took it to court, but they went behind the veil of that status of that corporate entity, like Rupert's Land, and they argued that the fundamental basis of their connection to lands and resources, how their fundamental connection to lands and resources is based on their sovereignty, their spiritual and cultural practices and beliefs. And the judge ruled in favor of them and struck down that corporate entity like Rupert's Land.
Well, and that just leads into a question that we just had. Let me find it here. And it was basically, let me see. We got something that popped up here, so now I can't open it. Governments provide funding to First Nation governments or Métis. They require legal status, so they have to incorporate. Do you see that changing?
Yeah, and I see it changing if you believe in our own jurisdiction and our inherent legal system. Give you an example. We set up the Assembly of First Nations, nationally.
Right.
Well, they're still implementing NIB Inc., corporate entity, through an administrative structure. They have never implemented the Assembly of First Nations, of the nations forming the Assembly of Nations at the national level, AFN level. Same here in Saskatchewan. We developed in 1980s, early 1980s, the FSIN Convention, which is a political agreement that's ratified by the membership of every band that belongs to the Federation of Nations. And it's a convention, not a constitution. But the convention, then, the governing bodies are implemented under the Convention Act of the Federation of Nations. And that Convention Act then governs our lawful assembly of our bands that are members of the Federation of Nations, whose seats in that assembly are not dedicated to a chief or a council. It's dedicated to a band, and there's no reason why those seats should be empty. But that assembly then provides for the lawful capacity for us to make laws collectively that apply at every level. And then we have the Convention Act that recognizes our executive council, with the executive and reps from each tribal area. They recognize our Indian Government Commission, recognizes all our boards, the Health and Social Development Board, Education Commission, and so on. And those are governing bodies under our own government jurisdiction law. But the young leadership here is still implementing FSI Inc. under an administrative structure. So this
Right.
whole political agenda that I laid out to you,
Yeah.
they're not even there. They're not even implementing that political agenda. That's why they're elected. They're elected under the Convention Act of the FSIN through the Election Act. But my point is, in the FSIN, then we have our own Finance Administration Act that occupies the field for whole jurisdiction of fiscal relations and financing, where they can enter into a government-to-government fiscal agreement under our own Finance Administration Act. The feds can use their own Finance Administration Act. You don't need those corporate entities to receive money. See?
Oh,
And you
my
go forward with your budget, your model of your budgeting. What they call our budget now are the contributions we get. That's not a budget. Now that's why the Métis in Alberta are having problems having to organize their associations,
Yeah.
because they believe that's the only way they can get money. But no, when you look at that Finance Administration Act that the feds have, in Saskatchewan, we got 74 bands of the Federation of Nations. Over half of them are under that Federal Finance Administration Act. And I say to them, what the hell for? We have our own Finance Administration Act that every band comes under, every tribal council and FSIN comes under. If you respect our jurisdiction, our legal capacity, and our inherent legal system.
Right.
Now you see, the problem they got is federally is that Finance Administration Act, that Land Management Act, that Taxation Commission, that all those laws that they've passed, Bill C-31 and so on, they're all passed under Section 9124. I told Bennett and Joe Wild, you're only doing that to restrict the application of the broad recognition under Section 35. So when they passed the Child Welfare Act, that came into effect last January 1st, she come looking for me. Bennett come looking for me at the AFN. He said, oh, here you are. She said, I heard you. We've now passed the Child Welfare Act that applies Section 35 and implements Section 35. I said, yeah, that's good, but it does something else. She said, what else does it do? I said, well, it implements the UNRIP. Oh, yes, he said, that's what it does too, she said. But she said, we're going to go with a health act, and I'm going to go with acts in every sector like you've been telling us we have to do. Now, you see, the point is here that Section 35 has increased Section 9124 powers under the BNA Act. And how? It now recognizes the federal jurisdiction for all those powers under the BNA Act that has 91 powers federally and Section 92 powers provincially under provincial government jurisdictional law for education, health, and all those areas. Well, those now become federal powers and jurisdiction, respecting their relationships with us under that framework I talk about. That's what Section 35 does. So they have to legislate their legal, fiscal, jurisdictional obligations. How? You implement inherent rights and treaty rights to education. How? Through a traditional contemporary education system. Under our own unique and special laws that govern the program standards for the traditional contemporary education system, and under unique and federal laws federally that govern the program standards under their jurisdiction for the traditional contemporary education system. The Auditor General told Indian Affairs and Health Canada a few years ago, your policies have no legislative base. Now you see, if you do an audit, one of the principles of doing an acceptable audit, qualified audit, first thing you have to do is audit what the program managers are doing in implementing the form of laws that are governing the program standards. Well, right now, there's no laws governing program standards for Indian or Métis federally at all. Yet they come with these damn agreements saying these are lawful agreements. Like hell they are. They're just policies. They're not law. You see?
Yeah.